The low growl of engines trembled through the steel bones of the USS Drayton as dawn broke over the Pacific. Sky and sea fused into a cold, silver plain, the horizon still unmarked, except for the faint silhouettes of escorting destroyers slicing through the swell. On the forward deck, Lieutenant Commander James Rourke braced himself against the rail and inhaled the smell of salt and oil, an aroma that had become the scent of the war itself. Somewhere beyond that mirrored horizon, Japanese cruisers and battleships were steaming toward their fate, unaware that the Americans had brought something new to the fight. Torpex, before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. It sat below, packed inside torpedoes, slung like predatory fish in the racks. Rourke didn't like giving names to weapons. Men died giving weapons names. But Torpex demanded one. It hissed danger, promised transformation. A mixture of TNT, RDX, and aluminum powder. It had been whispered about for months, first in coded memos, then in the back rooms of naval briefings, and now on the lips of sailors who touched the torpedoes like relics. The British had used it first in their midget sub-attacks, or so rumor went. But the Americans, as always, had added their own flavor to the recipe. Stronger, meaner, designed to tear through armor plate that Japanese engineers once boasted was invincible. Rourke wasn't a man to romanticize explosives, but even he could feel the weight of what they carried. Below deck, Ensign Carlo Yamada, half Japanese, half Italian, all American, checked the loading clamps again, fingers tapping lightly over metal. For him, the war was personal in ways the others could only imagine. The Empire had taken his cousins in Manila, had starved them and worked them until they were bones. Now he served on a ship whose sole job was to hunt the vessels of the country his grandparents had once spoken of with reverence. He felt no conflict. The war had burned any doubts out of him long ago. A shout came from the bridge. "Report to Combat Information Center." Yamada wiped his hands and hurried up the ladders. The CIC hummed with machinery and tension. Rourke stood at the plotting table while the radar operator traced a finger across the screen. "New contacts, sir. Bearing 180, multiple large returns. Could be a cruiser group." Rourke studied the blips. He had seen many like them in the past 2 years. Columns of steel giants that pushed across the ocean with ritualistic arrogance. Japanese ships were beautifully built, their armor angled like the scales of a dragon. Admirals, back in Tokyo, boasted of superior craftsmanship, of welded hulls and armored belts that could shrug off anything America threw at them. Maybe that had once been true. Not anymore. "Sound General Quarters," Rourke ordered calmly. Klaxons blared, echoing through the ship. Boots thundered across metal decks. Below, sailors sprinted to their battle stations, torpedo crews strapped in, sweating already in the stifling heat of the lower compartments. Yamada took his place beside Torpedo Tube 1, the polished fins gleaming under red emergency lights. "Easy, boys," he said to the crew. "We're about to give the Emperor a rude awakening." One of the gunners smirked, but the humor didn't mask the fear in his eyes. Hundreds of miles away, aboard the Otago, flagship of the Japanese cruiser division, Vice Admiral Takeo Kajimoto stood on the bridge, scanning the same dawn horizon. His uniform was immaculate, his posture rigid, his pride enormous. Otago was his castle, a floating monument to Japanese naval doctrine. 2 inches of hardened steel wrapped the hull. The main belt was thick enough that American torpedoes, weak with their old TNT and plagued by unreliable detonators, could do little more than rattle her bones. But rumors had drifted in across the sea as insidious as fog, American torpedoes exploding with monstrous force, whole hulls lifted out of water, a single hit, sinking vessels thought unsinkable. Kajimoto dismissed most of it as propaganda. And yet, in the quiet hours before dawn, he wondered. The Americans had always been inventive when cornered. Their arrogance was matched only by their creativity. A junior officer approached, bowing deeply. "Admiral, our scout planes report possible destroyers to the north. They appear to be maneuvering for an attack run." Kajimoto exhaled. Then let them come. We will show them what true armor looks like. He watched the officer depart, feeling the faint quiver of his own confidence. That armor had always been the shield of the Japanese Navy. Without it, what were they? Battleships and cruisers were shrines of steel, embodiments of decades of engineering belief. To admit armor might no longer protect them was to admit the world had changed. Kajimoto was not ready to admit that. Back on the Drayton, the sea tightened like fabric stretched over a drum. The American destroyers spread out, forming a spear aimed southward. Rourke's voice cut through the intercom. All stations, stand by to attack. Torpedo crews prepare to fire on my command. Yamada placed a hand on the Torpex-filled warhead, feeling its cold promise. The first shells arrived as distant flashes, orange blossoms blooming on the horizon. Seconds later came the howl and crash as they tore up plumes of water near the American ships. "They've spotted us!" someone shouted. Rourke steadied himself as the bridge shook. "Helm! Full speed! Bring us in closer!" The plan was simple, brutal and gut-wrenching. Close the distance, get inside the Japanese firing pattern, and unleash the new torpedoes at ranges so short that even evasive maneuvers wouldn't save the targets. It required reckless courage, and Rourke's crew had it. Spray soaked the deck as the Drayton heeled hard, charging through exploding geysers. Yamada held onto the torpedo tube controls, teeth clenched, heart hammering. Above, the ship quivered under the thunder of its own guns, firing in rapid salvos. Inside the Japanese formation, Kajimoto watched with mounting irritation. Americans, always charging in like madmen. But when he studied the enemy destroyers more carefully, something unsettled him. They weren't simply harassing, they were committing. "Signal all ships," Kajimoto snapped. "Prepare for torpedo attack." His officers relayed the order, but the Americans were already too close. The ocean around Otago roared as her main batteries opened fire, the shockwave rattling windows, armor plating glowed from the heat of rapid salvos. Yet the destroyers kept coming, their wakes curling like white claws. Kajimoto narrowed his eyes. What are they carrying that they are so desperate to deliver? Then he saw it. Thin white trails erupting from the American sides, torpedoes, a wave of them, nothing unusual. But also something different. The wake patterns were denser, somehow heavier, as if the water itself recoiled around the speeding weapons. Kajimoto frowned. "Hard to port," he ordered, but physics did not care about pride. The Otago was a giant. Maneuverability was its tax. The torpedoes closed fast. Too fast. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Yamada watched the torpedo leave the tube, bubbles swirling. The recoil shuddered through the hull like a living growl. He whispered a silent prayer, not for the enemy, but for the friends he'd lost. He prayed the torpedo would speak for him. On the surface, the warhead raced forward like a silver bullet under glass. Crewmen on the destroyer cheered as the weapons sliced toward the cruiser silhouette in the distance. For a moment, everything went silent. Even the sea seemed to hold its breath. Then, a white plume burst from the side of the Japanese cruiser, rising higher than the mast. A column of water, steel, and fire punched skyward. The force was so violent that even from miles away the Americans felt the concussion vibrating through their hulls. Rourke whipped around to see the shock wave ripple across the water, his gut tightening. "That was Torpex," he murmured. Nothing in his career had prepared him for the sight. Below deck, Yamada felt the deck tilt slightly as the ship rode the blast wave. He grinned fiercely. "Good hit," he whispered. But another plume rose, this one even larger, as a second torpedo detonated. The Otago shuddered, her lights flickering. Kajimoto was thrown against a bulkhead. Officers tumbled, shouts turning to screams as pipes burst and sparks rained from overhead. What was that?" one officer stammered, eyes wide with terror. That wasn't TNT. Kajimoto steadied himself, breath ragged. No, it was something else. Another explosion tore through the hull. The deck lurched like a kicking horse, sending men sprawling again. Damage reports flooded the bridge. Admiral, the armor belt, it's been breached. Completely breached. Compartments are flooding at uncontrollable rates. That's impossible, Kajimoto barked. Our armor is reinforced. It's gone, sir. It's been ripped open like paper. Kajimoto's heart sank. The impossible had happened. For decades, Japanese naval strategy relied on the belief that their carefully angled armor could absorb any hit. But this was no ordinary explosive. It bit deeper, spread faster. Torpex released gas bubbles that weakened water resistance, allowing shock waves to inflict massive structural damage. All theory until now. Kajimoto felt the cold claws of realization close around his chest. The Americans had reinvented naval warfare. The battle unfolded in chaotic beauty. The destroyers darted like wolves around a wounded stag as the Japanese formation broke apart. A cruiser nearby attempted to turn and present its armored bow toward the Americans. But another Torpex torpedo slammed beneath its keel. A thunderous crack echoed across the sea as the ship's belly ruptured, lifting the cruiser clear out of the water in a grotesque arc. Sailors on Rourke's crew stared, stunned. "By God," one whispered, "it's tearing them open from the inside." Rourke gripped the binoculars tighter. "We're witnessing the end of an era," he said quietly. "After today, no admiral will trust armor alone." Torpedoes streaked from other U.S. ships, their wakes glowing in the fiery reflection of burning cruisers. Japanese gunners fired desperately, but the destroyers were too fast. Every time they thought they had routed the attack, another devastating blast erupted where armor should have held. Yamada assisted with reloading, sweat dripping from his brow despite the cold. His thoughts darted toward Manila, toward the memories of starving relatives. "This is for them," he said through clenched teeth. The crew around him moved with grim determination. "Prepare another salvo!" Rourke shouted. The Drayton continued its attack run, weaving through shell fire. Overhead, pieces of metal rained from the skies like apocalyptic hail. The Japanese ships were fighting, but fear had crept into their ranks. Years of faith in engineering superiority were dissolving under the merciless explosions. Inside the sinking Otago, Kajimoto tried to regain control. "Counter-flood the forward compartments," he ordered. "We must stabilize the list." But the damage was catastrophic. Bulkheads buckled. Water poured in through torn seams. Pumps were overwhelmed within minutes. "Admiral," a lieutenant gasped, "the Americans, their torpedoes have changed. They're using something far more powerful than TNT. The blast pressure, it's unlike anything we've seen." Kajimoto knew. He knew even before the lieutenant said it. He stared at the rising smoke outside the shattered bridge windows. His ship, once his pride, was dying. Not because of poor tactics, not because of American luck, because American science had outpaced Japanese belief. He grabbed the rail as the floor pitched. "Signal headquarters," he ordered. Tell them the Americans have created a weapon that renders our armor meaningless." His voice cracked slightly. "Tell them everything must change." The young officer swallowed hard. "Hi, Admiral." Kajimoto watched him run, then looked at the carnage unfolding across the deck. Fires raged. Men shouted prayers. Water surged up the stairwells. A ship that had once embodied invincibility now groaned like a wounded beast. Kajimoto whispered a final confession to the rising sun. "We underestimated them." On the Drayton, the battle was turning. Columns of smoke stretched miles across the ocean, where burning cruisers listed heavily, their crews abandoning ship. The American destroyers continued circling, ensuring the Japanese force was unable to regroup. Yamada leaned against the torpedo rack, chest heaving. He had never seen destruction like this, not even in the worst Manila stories. It was overwhelming, terrifying, and yet liberating. For once, the Americans weren't the ones struggling to catch up. For once, they possessed the secret weapon. He closed his eyes and imagined the war ending sooner because of what happened today. "Ensign," Rourke said over the intercom, "good shooting down there." "Thank you, sir," Yamada replied, voice steady. "But stay sharp, we're not done yet." He opened his eyes. He knew victory today was only the first crack in a much larger wall. The Japanese Navy still had battleships, carriers, admirals, who refused to bow to changing tides. They would adapt, they would strike back, and the Americans would need to keep innovating, keep pushing, keep daring. But for now, for this single day, the ocean belonged to them. Smoke-choked sunlight filtered over the water as the last Japanese cruiser began to roll, its massive hull groaning like a dying leviathan. Torpex had torn through its armor with surgical brutality. Rourke lowered his binoculars. "History books will talk about this," he murmured. Yamada nodded to himself. They would, because today, armor had died, and every admiral in Japan would feel the aftershock. The first reports from the German border radar stations arrived as a string of clipped, jittering teleprinter notes, numbers, headings, altitude estimates, and the usual early morning uncertainty. But to the Luftwaffe duty officers, their meaning landed with the weight of cold iron, bombers again, and many of them. But this time, something else. The radar returns showed an unusually dense cluster around the bomber groups. At first, operators assumed it was a quirk of atmospheric interference. Then the patterns sharpened. Smaller, faster signals moving in tight and unnatural formation. That alone would have been enough to stir unease, but it was the direction that brought every eye up from the consoles. They were heading for the heartland again, straight toward Berlin. By then, far beneath the high, flat winter clouds, the pilots of the 4th, 352nd and 357th Fighter Groups were already sliding into range, engines humming in a low, predatory unison. Their long-range drop tanks, painted dull and utilitarian, hung under their wings like the promise of something the Luftwaffe didn't yet understand. Persistence. They had fuel enough to cross the Rhine, cut through the central industrial belt and still stay with the bombers all the way to the capital. Inside the cockpit of one P-51, Captain Reed adjusted his oxygen mask and glanced up through the canopy. The sun broke in faint slivers across the polished metal of his wings, and a faint vibration ran through the Merlin engine as if it was anticipating its work. His squadron leader's voice crackled through the headset, calm but unmistakably charged. "All right, boys, looks like Jerry's about to wake up angry. Stay tight. Remember, today we go all the way." Those words sent an electric ripple through his nerves. Go all the way to Berlin. No half measures, no punch and pull back like the early war raids. Not today. Back in Berlin, in the Reich Air Ministry, General Oberst Peter Dittmar pushed through the doorway of the operations room, coat still half-buttoned, face lined by another night of restless calculation. The officers gathered around the plotting table rose at his entrance, but he waved them down. "What have we got?" "Bomber streams inbound, sir. Initial interceptors already scrambled along the western vectors." "And the escorts?" There was a pause, brief but heavy. "Uncertain, Herr General Oberst. Radar indicates unusual density." Dittmar stepped to the map. He knew the meaning. He had seen the reports of P-51 appearances farther east than previously possible, but those had been isolated, sporadic, easily dismissed as exceptions, not patterns. He leaned over the table, studying the scattering of tokens representing fighter wings, airfields, anti-aircraft placements. "How far along did the escorts appear?" "Still with the bombers over Aachen." A slow, cold dread traveled through him. Aachen was far too deep. Escorts should have turned back long before that, should have been low on fuel, should have been dwindling, always dwindling. That was the rhythm of the war. American fighters could sting, yes, but they couldn't stay. But these were not falling away. If anything, they were thickening. No one spoke the obvious conclusion. They didn't have to. At precisely the same moment, high above the countryside, Reed caught sight of the first specks rising from the horizon, black dots climbing in slow arcs, enemy fighters gaining altitude, forming up into attack lines. The squadron tightened. The bombers held their precise, disciplined shape, vast and indifferent as a steel tide. Reed steadied his breathing, watching the German formations swell into sharper detail. FW-190s first, then BF-109s, climbing hard. His squadron leader's voice came low and level. "Reed, you're with me. We cut them off before they reached the heavies." The throttle slid forward. The Mustang surged, the Merlin's note rising into a clean, eager snarl. The drop tanks rattled for a moment as the airflow shifted, then steadied. Reed felt the aircraft come alive beneath him, not merely a machine, but a creature suddenly given the scent of prey. The German fighters spotted them moments later. The first attack run dissolved before it even began. The Luftwaffe formations, expecting the usual small escort screen, instead found themselves confronted by a wall of Mustangs sweeping down with coordinated, disciplined precision. Reed saw the lead 190 hesitate, literally wobble in the air before attempting a desperate break to roll away. Too late. His squadron leader stitched rounds across the fuselage, and the German fighter broke apart in a burst of flame and tumbling fragments. Reed rolled right, dove after another pair of 109s attempting to slip around the edge of the escort. He fired, felt the recoil through the frame, watched tracers reach out and strike the tail of one enemy fighter. The 109 shuddered, then nosed down sharply, trailing smoke. Below him, the bomber stream continued its solemn, unstoppable march toward the capital. Back in Berlin's operational command, the room had heated into a storm of overlapping voices, the teleprinters chattering incessantly, dispatch riders moving at a near run. Dietmar banged a glove against the desk, cutting through the noise. "Report." A junior officer stepped forward, pale but composed. "Sir, our first wave was intercepted well short of effective range. Enemy fighters are more numerous than expected. They are maintaining formation with the bombers." "How many?" "Too many to count, sir. They're everywhere." It was an exaggeration, but no one challenged it. Dietmar pressed his fingers against the bridge of his nose. Everywhere. That was not reconnaissance. That was not a probing attack. That was doctrine. Deliberate. Prepared. A new sheet slid from the teleprinter. An intelligence officer scanned it, then stiffened. "Herr Generaloberst, intercept units from Frankfurt report P-51s still active. Still pursuing." "That's impossible. They cannot reach that far." "They are, sir." The room fell into an uneasy silence, broken only by the distant rumble of a passing tram outside, a mundane reminder of a city already living beneath the shadow of bombs. Dietmar spoke again, more quietly. "Endurance fighters, long range." The words felt foreign in his mouth, against years of confident assessments that Allied fighters would never escort their bombers deep into the fatherland. Now they were doing exactly that. Meanwhile, Reed's squadron continued its deadly dance. The sky had dissolved into a storm of vapor trails, spinning debris, engine smoke, and the brief, terrible blossoms of exploding aircraft. Yet, through it all, the P-51s remained near the bombers, never drifting, never breaking too far from the groups they defended. Several German fighters managed to get close enough to begin firing on the bomber wings, but each time a Mustang would appear, sometimes from below, sometimes out of the sun, sometimes from an angle no one anticipated. The Luftwaffe pilots found themselves fighting ghosts that struck fast and vanished even faster. Reed narrowly avoided a burst of cannon fire from a camouflaged FW-190 that had lunged up through the contrails. He yanked hard into a climbing spiral, engine protesting. The 190 followed, persistent. Reed pushed the throttle to the limit, trying to gain just a few meters more. The 190 drew closer, guns flickering. Tracers zipped past his wing and canopy. A voice suddenly cut across the radio, sharp and triumphant. "Reed, brake!" He rolled instinctively. A P-51 from another group dove past him, guns flaring, catching the 190 in a lethal crossfire. The German fighter erupted into shards of metal and fire that spiraled downward like a broken comet. Reed steadied his breathing again. Thank God for the Mustang. By late morning, a second and third wave of Luftwaffe fighters scrambled frantically, draining fuel reserves, pulling pilots from nearby training units, even calling up older aircraft previously deemed unfit for frontline service. Anything that could fly was thrown into the sky. But each wave met the same ruthless conclusion. And now, for the first time since 1943, the German High Command had no illusions left to cling to. The P-51s were not an occasional nuisance. They were a new reality, a weapon designed to escort bombers not just across the Channel, not just past the frontier, but into the very center of Germany, even to the doorstep of its capital. One intelligence officer, his voice cracking with disbelief, whispered to a colleague, "They flew 1,600 kilometers, and they're still fighting." The colleague did not respond. There was nothing to say. Outside Berlin, the air raid sirens began to rise, long, wavering notes shuddering across the rooftops. Civilians poured into the shelters, shouting, clutching children and valuables. The dull, distant thunder of the approaching bomber formations vibrated through the cold winter air. Inside one underground shelter, a middle-aged woman clutched a suitcase filled with family photographs, her knuckles white. A stranger beside her murmured something about the Americans never making it this far before. She nodded numbly, unable to process the magnitude. Back in the sky, Reed glanced down. Far beneath him, the sprawl of the German countryside began to fade into the outskirts of Berlin. Factories, rail yards, smokestacks, all laid out in neat, methodical grids. The bombers adjusted formation, preparing for the run. Another call from his leader. "Mustangs, tighten defense. This is the point where Jerry throws everything he's got left." The Germans did exactly that. From the east, a fresh formation of Bf-109s surged upward in a desperate climb. Many were flown by green pilots with barely 40 hours of cockpit time, but their orders were simple. Attack the bombers at any cost. Several dove headlong through the outer escort ring, guns blazing wildly. It was reckless, but it nearly worked. One bomber took a hit to the wing root, flames licking across the frame. Reed saw it dropping back, trailing smoke, its crew struggling to stabilize. He dove toward it instinctively, scanning for threats. A lone 109 looped around, lining up for a finishing strike on the wounded bomber. Reed pressed the trigger, his tracers converging on the German fighter. The 109 jerked violently, then disintegrated as a wing tore off, but the bomber was too damaged. Reed watched helplessly as the crew bailed out one by one, small, dark figures drifting down beneath blossoming white parachutes. The plane fell into a slow, mournful spiral before it exploded far below. He didn't have time to grieve. Another enemy wing was forming ahead. Back in Berlin, Commander Communications Officer, visibly shaken, approached Dittmar with a fresh set of reports. "Sir, it's confirmed. The escorts have reached the city. They are directly over Berlin airspace." The entire room stilled. For years, the capital had relied on the belief, a military certainty, that the city's final shield was distance. Distance that no escort fighter on Earth could overcome. That shield had been shattered. A senior general, older and less guarded than the others, exhaled bitterly. "So, the Americans have found their sword." Another replied softly, "No, they have found our weakness." The first bombs began to fall moments later, the sound rolling through the city like the footsteps of some ancient titan. Anti-aircraft batteries erupted in frantic thunder, peppering the sky with black bursts. But the P-51s were there too, diving and weaving, clearing assault paths, punishing any German fighter that tried to approach. Reed felt the shock wave of a flak burst slam against his Mustang, rattling the canopy. He steadied his grip, eyes scanning for movement. His wingman's voice came through, nervous but controlled. "This is insane. We're really here." Reed didn't respond. Words seemed too small. Everywhere he looked, he saw the choreography of war at its most terrible. Bombers releasing payloads, contrails crisscrossing like white scars across the heavens, fighters spiraling in duels that lasted seconds but felt like eternities, fires bloomed across industrial yards, smoke climbed in thick pillars. Yet, through all the chaos, the P-51s remained a constant, an unbroken perimeter of gleaming metal and unwavering resolve. They had come farther than any fighter force before them. Eventually, the bombers completed their runs, turning westward in slow, disciplined arcs. The escorts closed around them again, battered but intact. The Luftwaffe, exhausted and bleeding from hours of combat, could no longer muster an effective pursuit. Reed exhaled for what felt like the first time in hours. They had done it. As the formation turned toward home, the sun dipping behind them, he glanced once more at the distant haze that had been Berlin. It looked almost peaceful from this height, like a smear of smoke on the horizon. But he knew the truth. The city, the command, the entire Luftwaffe infrastructure had felt something today that could not be undone. A shift, a realization, a moment in history where the war had tilted irrevocably toward its end. Because today, for the first time, Germany understood that the sky itself no longer belonged to them. The Mustangs and bombers angled westward, their long shadows stretching across the hazy afternoon sky like dark blades. Below them, Germany rolled past. Cold fields, battered towns, fractured rail lines, and endless scars carved by war. The men in the cockpits stared ahead, drained and wordless. Hours earlier, the capital of the Reich had burned beneath them. Now the horizon felt impossibly far away, a distant promise of safety suspended on engines running well past their limits. Reed kept glancing at the temperature gauge. The Merlin's readings jittered toward the high end, still safe, but close enough to make his nerves hum. He leaned forward slightly, as if that gesture alone could coax the machine home. His squadron leader's voice cracked across the radio, weary but steady. "Keep tight, don't relax yet. Jerry's not done, not until we cross that coastline." No one argued. Everyone knew it was true. The Luftwaffe, wounded but stubborn, had a habit of launching last-ditch intercept attempts when Allied formations were at their most fatigued. Reed scanned the sky constantly, adrenaline trying to reignite despite the exhaustion that crawled up from the base of his skull. Then, from the rear of the formation, a nervous voice broke through. "Unknown aircraft, low and fast, coming in from the southeast." The words hit like cold water. Reed spun his Mustang slightly off-axis, peering down through the blue haze. For a moment, he saw nothing but drifting contrails and distant cloud tufts. Then, movement. 3 fast-moving specks hugging the terrain, too distant to identify, but coming in at a speed the eye could feel even before the mind named it. His leader spoke again. "All fighters, roll right and drop. We intercept." Reed pulled the stick gently, letting the Mustang slip into a downward arc. His stomach rolled as he descended. The specks grew larger, angular, predatory shapes. Focke-Wulfs, 3 of them, maybe more behind the first cluster. They had used the ground itself as cover, climbing at the last moment to strike the bomber formation from below. A bold move, a desperate one. The Germans climbed hard, engines screaming under the strain. Reed watched the lead, 190, curving upward toward the bomber wing on the far left. He didn't wait for the order. He throttled up and dove. The world funneled into a blur. The wind hammered the canopy. His Mustang, despite the fatigue in its frame, responded like a creature unleashed. The German pilot never saw him. Reed's burst struck square across the fuselage, clean, precision impacts. The 190 lurched sideways, trailing smoke, then rolled onto its back as fire blossomed under the cowling. Reed streaked past it, pulling up to avoid the debris. To his right, another P-51 sliced across the path of a second German fighter, scattering it with a diagonal burst that left it tumbling like a severed wing. But one got through. A lone FW-190 punched a line of cannon shells into the belly of a B-17, and Reed watched in horror as panels tore loose, flames licked along the wing route. The bomber listed violently, struggled, then fell away from the formation. Reed veered toward it instinctively, scanning for parachutes. But the fire spread too fast. The bomber plummeted, nose down, vanishing into the cloud deck below in a silent, downward scream. He forced himself to pull away. There was nothing to be done. Within moments, the skirmish ended. The remaining German fighters, seeing their attack crushed by a wall of Mustangs, broke off and fled eastward. Reed's breathing slowed, but the ache inside him deepened. Loss was inevitable, but witnessing it, feeling the helplessness, never dulled. The formation reassembled. Bombers limped, fighters tightened. Home still lay, hours away. As they pressed west, uncertainty flickered in every cockpit. The weather ahead had worsened. Low, ragged clouds bunched together like torn fabric. West Germany's winter skies were treacherous even on calm days. Reed wiped a smear of condensation from the inside of his canopy with his thumb, blinking at the fog that encroached around them. "Stay sharp," came the order. "Radio traffic reports possible flak pockets near the Rhine." Possible. That word always meant likely. Sure enough, as they approached the broad silver band of the river, dark blooms erupted along the lower clouds, scattered flak bursts, probing, irregular, almost lazy in their aim, but still deadly. Reed braced himself as fragments rattled lightly against the belly and wings, the sound sharp but mercifully brief. The flak thinned almost as soon as it appeared, more a token resistance than genuine threat. But it was what came after that caught the formation by surprise. A wall of cloud, a thick, unbroken barrier that stretched from horizon to horizon, waited like some vast ancient curtain. The bomber formations began to disappear inside it, swallowed whole, their silhouettes dimming into soft, ghostly blurs. Reed hesitated, then pushed into the whiteness, and the world fell away. Inside the cloud bank, everything narrowed. His windows fogged, the sun vanished, the roar of the engine felt distant, swallowed by the soft, suffocating grey. For a brief moment, disorientation crept in. The uncanny feeling that the aircraft was tilting even when the instruments insisted it wasn't. He steadied himself by focusing on a single dial. Artificial horizon. Needle straight. Keep it straight. Radio chatter echoed faintly, muffled by static. Can't see anything. Tighten spacing. Don't climb, don't climb. Reed breathed slow, measured breaths. The cloud pressed in so thickly it felt almost tactile. Then light. They burst out over the western edge of the cloud bank, the sky opening above them in a crystalline dome. Far ahead, he saw the first glints of the sea. England. Not yet, but close enough to feel it. To the north, smoke from RAF coastal towns rose in thin grey plumes, signs of industry and life. To the southwest, the sun sank into a molten line on the horizon. The light painted the formation in gold, making the Mustangs shine like burnished steel guardians. For the first time all day, Reed allowed himself to exhale fully. His wingman pulled alongside him, giving a small, exhausted salute. Reed returned it with a nod, too tired for anything more expressive. As the coastline approached, the tension that had been coiled inside every man began to unravel. One by one, bombers peeled off toward their assigned bases. Fighters drifted down into lower, more relaxed patterns. The shapes of the English fields, patchwork greens and muddy browns, came into view, dotted with farmhouses and narrow hedgerows. Civilization, safety, home. Reed felt something tighten in his chest, not pain, but a weight of emotion he hadn't let himself touch since takeoff, the kind of heaviness that came from surviving something immense, something too big for the mind to contain all at once. He lowered his flaps and banked gently toward his airfield. The runway stretched out like a welcoming ribbon. As he touched down, the tires screeched faintly, bouncing once before gripping the earth. He rolled forward, engine humming softer now, breathing shallower, as if the Mustang were finally letting itself rest. Ground crews ran alongside the returning aircraft, pointing, shouting, helping guide them into position. Mechanics rushed to the bombers, counting flak holes, checking engines, helping crews down from the ladders. Some of the men limped, others shook uncontrollably. A few wept openly beside their aircraft. Reed shut down his engine. The Merlin coughed twice, then sighed into silence. He removed his oxygen mask and helmet slowly, as though any sudden motion might break the fragile sense of relief settling over him. His squadron leader climbed from his own Mustang and walked toward him, face streaked with sweat and soot. He stopped beside Reed's aircraft and rested a hand on the wing. "Hell of a show up there," he said quietly. Reed nodded, too tired to answer. They stood there a few seconds in silence, watching the surviving Mustangs taxi in, each one carrying stories of the day etched into their scorched paint and chipped metal. Finally, the squadron leader spoke again. "Berlin," he said. Just that. One word, but heavy with meaning. Reed exhaled, long and slow. "We made it," he replied. "Yeah," the leader murmured. "And Jerry knows it." Across the channel in Berlin, the night had settled like a suffocating blanket. Fires still burned in parts of the city, reflected in the wet streets, turning puddles into trembling pools of orange light. Civilians moved silently through the ruins, carrying buckets of water, searching for missing relatives, whispering stunned questions about how American fighters had escorted bombers into the very heart of the Reich. In the Reich Air Ministry, General Oberst Dittmar remained at the plotting table long after most officers had left. The map lay untouched before him. The markers showing Luftwaffe squadrons sat where they had been hours earlier, like frozen pieces in a game whose outcome had already been sealed. He traced the line of the bomber route with a gloved finger. Aachen, Kassel, Magdeburg, Berlin, then back again. Escorted the entire way. He felt a weariness deeper than any he had known. A kind of spiritual fatigue. The Luftwaffe had once owned the skies. Now it clung to them by a thread, and even that thread was fraying. He whispered to the empty room. "They flew to Berlin, and we could not stop them." The words echoed faintly in the high ceiling, swallowed by the cavernous silence. Back in England, Reed and the remaining pilots gathered in the briefing hut, where an intelligence officer was already writing summary notes on a chalkboard. The stove in the corner glowed with a comforting red heat. The room smelled of damp uniforms, hot metal, and the faint, sweet trace of tea. One pilot sank into a chair, rubbing his face with both hands. "God Almighty," he said softly, "all the way to Berlin." Reed sat nearby, staring at nothing in particular. His mind replayed fragments, tracer lines, engine smoke, the burning bomber, the ghostly silence inside the cloud bank, the first glimpse of the sea. He wasn't thinking of victory, not of triumph or glory, but of endurance, of men on both sides, pushed far past what any human being should be asked to bear. A mechanic entered and tapped Reed on the shoulder. "Sir," he said gently, "your Mustang's got more holes than a sieve, but she flew true. Damn near perfect." Reed smiled weakly. "She always does." As the night deepened and the pilots drifted off to bunks or to the mess for something warm to drink, Reed stepped outside alone. The wind was cold, carrying the faint smell of fuel and the distant rumble of other aircraft landing. Above him, the stars shone clearly, cold, sharp points scattered across the black sky. He looked at them for a long time, letting the quiet settle in his muscles. He thought of the German pilots he'd fought that day, not as faceless enemies, but as men, as fragile and mortal as himself, fighting for reasons tangled beyond their control. He thought of the bomber crews, brave and stubborn, who held their course through fire and chaos. He thought of the burned city behind him and the long road still ahead. War had many turning points, but today felt like one of the ones history would remember. A moment when the skies tilted, when endurance met innovation, when the world felt the future shifting beneath its feet. He closed his eyes briefly. Tomorrow, they would fly again. But tonight, for a fleeting moment, the sky was still, and the engines were silent, and Reed allowed himself to breathe. Night settled slowly over the airfield, a bruised blue darkness stretching across the English countryside as if trying to soothe the violence of the day. Reed sat alone, on the wing of his Mustang, legs dangling, the metal warm where the engine had only recently cooled. The mechanics had already swarmed over the aircraft and drifted away again, leaving the plane silent, patched and scarred, an echo of the man who'd flown it. He watched the bombers being towed into their dispersals, the crews shuffling toward debriefing, with that same hollow-eyed mixture of fatigue, disbelief, and pride. They had gone farther than anyone said was possible. They had pierced the German capital under full escort. They had done what the Luftwaffe had considered unthinkable. A shadow approached, stopping beside the wing. "General Andrews." "Pilot Reed," he said quietly. "Hell of a day." Reed nodded, unable to summon anything more articulate. The general looked over the silent field where ground crews worked by low red lamps and wind scraped across the tarmac. "There's something you should know," Andrews said. "Intelligence intercepted a message out of Berlin. High Command is shaken, furious. Not at us, at themselves, at their failures, at the realization that their skies aren't theirs anymore." Reed breathed out slowly. The idea felt surreal. Those unreachable men in polished halls suddenly aware that the war had tilted under their feet. "Their world changed today," Andrews added, "and you helped do it." The general walked off, leaving Reed with the cooling Mustang and the quiet hum of distant generators. For the first time, Reed allowed himself to picture the mission not as survival, but as history. He touched the wing beside him, warm, solid, real. Somewhere across the channel, the German High Command was staring into a darkness it had never imagined. And for the first time, Reed felt that victory, however distant, had taken its first real breath. Up next, you've got two more standout stories, right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.